Cognitive Phenomenology and Time, a Summary. The Central Question. This master's thesis by Stephen McClelland addresses a fundamental question in philosophy of mind: is there something it feels like to think? This is the core issue in cognitive phenomenology. The debate divides philosophers into two camps: inclusivists like Charles Seward, David Pitt, William Leakin argue that thinking does have its own distinctive phenomenological character. Exclusivists like Michael Tye, David Bourget maintain that any felt sense during thinking is actually sensory in nature. We mistake sensory experiences for cognitive ones. McClelland defends a limited inclusivist position: there is a genuine, non-sensory phenomenology of thinking, but not all cognitive activity necessarily has it. The problem with how we discuss thinking. A key insight of the thesis is that philosophers have been talking past each other because they lack a clear, standardized definition of what thinking actually is. Many philosophical discussions treat thinking as if it were a static propositional state, like thinking that rabbits have tails, which McClelland argues is actually just holding a conclusion in mind, not the active process of thinking itself. A current thinking. The focus of this thesis refers to the dynamic, unfolding process where we work through problems, manipulate concepts, and seek outcomes we don't yet know. This is fundamentally different from merely entertaining a thought or recalling a conclusion. The dynamic phenomenology of thinking (DPT). McClelland builds on Fergus Anderson's dynamic phenomenology of thinking framework, which identifies three stages in the process of a current thinking: imagining inquisition, the active, generative phase where we explore possibilities, test hypotheses, and piece together relevant information. There's a phenomenological sense of doing and making here. Beholding acquisition, a moment of clarity or aha experience where some aspect of the solution becomes directly apparent. This feels receptive rather than active, like receiving rather than creating. Representing mediation, the final stage where we formulate the result, often as verbal propositions. There's a sense of double-checking and mediating the outcome for coherence. These stages aren't rigid, thinkers may cycle between them, and once we've passed through them, later thinking about the same topic can skip earlier stages. Key concepts and framework. Intentional objects and acts. Intentional object, what the thinking is about, the subject matter, concept, or problem. Intentional act, how we engage with that object, thinking, believing, desiring, etc. First and second order properties from William Leakin. First order cue properties, sensory properties of objects represented mentally: colors, shapes, sounds. Second order phenomenological properties, the what it's like feeling of experiencing those properties. This distinction is crucial. The phenomenology of thinking is a second order property that arises from the interaction between intentional object and intentional act, not from the sensory content itself. The concept of tension. A central contribution of McClelland's thesis is identifying the phenomenological tension between intentional object and intentional act. This tension occurs because we're focused on the goal outcome rather than the process. Our attention shifts between examining the object and the act of examining it. This creates a feeling of resistance or movement that's characteristic of thinking. Methodology, microphenomenology. To test the DPT framework, McClelland employs the microphenomenological interview method developed by Claire Petitmanian and colleagues. This approach evokes a specific experience rather than having subjects merely describe it from memory. Uses non-leading questions to explore the how rather than the what of experience. Identifies microgestures, subtle, pre-reflective sensations that signal shifts in cognitive structure. Avoids the pitfalls of traditional introspection by cultivating open, diffuse, receptive awareness. Evidence and analysis. McClelland analyzes three examples: Anderson's example, defining the abstract word although, tracing the journey from not knowing through imagining to beholding to representing. Self-interview, defining the relationship between continuity and permanence, capturing the phenomenological sense of resistance, movement, and aha moments. Participant interview T, similar patterns emerged, with T describing a sense of translation rather than verbal formulation. Common themes across all three, movement, resistance, and tension are consistently present, especially during transitions between stages. The tension lessens as thinking progresses toward resolution. Why this matters? Shifting the debate. McClelland argues that by framing thinking as a dynamic, multi-stage process rather than a static mental state, we can standardize discussions about what we mean by thinking. Explain puzzling cases like Seward's example of suddenly realizing which book his friend meant, without conscious content. Distinguish thinking from daydreaming through the element of directedness and purpose. Address why we can think without being fully aware of the content, the tension between object and act. Philosophical implications. This framework challenges the analytic tradition's tendency to treat thinking as purely propositional. The exclusivist position that cognitive phenomenology reduces to sensory experience. Chudnoff's self-presentational view which conflates phenomenal properties with intentional acts. Instead, McClelland argues for keeping intentional and phenomenal elements distinct while recognizing their interplay. The phenomenology of thinking emerges from the interaction, not from either element alone. Conclusion. The thesis presents thinking as a temporally extended, dynamic process with distinctive phenomenological qualities. By integrating Lekin's distinction between first and second-order properties with Anderson's DPT framework and the microphenomenological method, McClelland provides a more nuanced picture of what thinking feels like and why. The tension between intentional object and intentional act is not a flaw but a feature. It's what gives thinking its characteristic phenomenological texture. Understanding this tension helps explain both the immediacy of thinking we know we're thinking and its opacity we often can't articulate how we got to a conclusion.